Welcome to today's program titled Pension Reform in Our Time, What Butch Lewis Means for Multi-Employer Plans and Participating Employers. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. For those of you who are logged into the web presentation, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the conference by typing them into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit for this webinar, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation that will be required on the CLE attendance affirmation form. Please write this code down as it will not be reread and is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and materials, along with the CLE attendance form, will be distributed to attendees in the days following the webinar. On the next slide, you will see a legal disclaimer. And at this time, I would like to turn it over to Ron Kramer. Ron, please go ahead. Mike, I believe Ron is muted. Can you unmute him, please?
Can you hear me, Kelly?
We can hear you now, Ron. Thank you.
All right. One of the roles of being the moderator is to be the first one to have problems with audio so everyone else feels good about it. Hello, everyone. My name is Ron Kramer. I'm a labor and employment partner here in Chicago at Seyfarth Shaw, and I'm happy to be presenting our program here today with colleagues from both coasts. Joining me from the West Coast, the Los Angeles office in our Employee Benefits Department is Alan Cabral and Song Kim, and from the East Coast in our Labor and Employment Department in Boston is Jim Blawick. We've got a lot to cover today, if you go to the next slide, so we're going to try and move through this so that we have time to talk and answer as many questions as you have. We're going to give a brief overview to bring everyone up to speed as to how we got to the law that we have today, and then go through the provisions of the American Rescue Plan Act with regards to multi-employer plans, and then have some good discussion, hopefully, amongst ourselves and amongst you as to what it means and what the outstanding questions are still out there. So next slide, and then the slide after that, why don't we just move right into a brief overview here. For those of you that haven't been living this for the last 40 years or so, I wanted to give you a little overview of where we are. The Multi-Employer Pension Plan Amendments Act, which was adopted in 1980, was major reform that was attempted to improve the funding status of multi-employer plans. That brought us, as many of you on this call know, brought us withdrawal liability. And that's how that came to be in that act. Fast forward 26 years, Congress is again passing laws to improve pensions, this time in the form of the Pension Protection Act, which was a broad law that covered not only multi-employer plans, but single employer plans, defined benefit, defined contribution. But that law was designed to also improve the funding status of plans. And one of the big things that it did with regards to multi-employer plans is that it created the zone system that we have today. Plans have to report whether they're critical or endangered status, and those plans have to put together rehabilitation or funding improvement plans to improve the funding status of those plans over time. Now, I've read online, commentary in terms of whether that act was good law or not, or whether it was did what it was intended to do. But regardless of the intentions, it didn't work out, and the Great Recession 2 years later did not help that. That brings us to the Multi-Employer Pension Reform Act of 2014. This was one of those bills that got slipped into an omnibus budget bill at the end of the year and passed. There were many provisions there designed to protect multi-employer plans, including rules with regards to partitions and mergers. But the big thing that came out of that was the creation of a new zone status, critical and declining status, and the ability of those plans to petition the government to suspend benefits, vested benefits, to avoid insolvency. And while I think there could be a lot of debate among the people on this call today as to whether that was a good way to reform pension plans or a fair way to do that, the fact of the matter is that didn't work out as intended. Some plans, including some large plans that were basically the intended beneficiaries of this, were denied their applications to suspend benefits. So that kind of brings us forward from a legislation standpoint to today. And then what about the status of the plans and the fund for that, the PBGC for that matter? The PBGC has been reporting that it's going to become insolvent with regards to the monies it has for covering multi-employer plans that are insolvent in 2027. And as reported by the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, as of 2017, they have 1,234 plans that were active in ongoing status, some 10.5 million participants, And what they were reporting was that if you looked at those financials from those plans using a 2.55% discount rate, that overall plans were only 42% funded and were underfunded by $670 billion. Now, no one uses a 2.55% discount rate for valuing assets and liabilities. I mean, so this number is clearly, at least in my opinion, overstated, but it gives you an idea of how things were looking at the time the American Rescue Plan was adopted. And if you go to the next slide, I think this is the more telling slide and the more helpful slide for our purposes. This is a breakout from the PBGC of those 1,234 plans where they fall under the zone status. And as you'll see this here, basically 114 plans, or 9.2% of the plans that are active, were critical and declining. Another 15.5%, or 191 plans, were critical. The majority of plans, 2/3 of the plans basically, were in green zone, and then only a small percentage were in the orange or yellow zone for endangered or seriously endangered plans. So, you know, in terms of the status, I mean, many funds are very well funded and are doing fine, but there is a small percentage that are critical and declining or critical. And, you know, from a comparison to the plans, the participants, even though there's basically about 25% of the plans are in critical or critical endangered status, almost 1/3 of the participants in plans overall are in those plans. So that's why there is a concern and a need to do something to assist those plans if we can. If you go to the next slide here, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going through these next 3 slides, but needless to say, given the issues that some of the pension plans are having and the failed attempts of Congress in the past, there have been several attempts in the last several years to engage in more comprehensive pension reform. The Butch-Lewis Act in 2017 being one of them, a joint select committee of Congress that was designed to put together a bill that everyone could accept was put together in 2018, but they couldn't come to an agreement. And there have been many other proposals. And I'm not going to go through each one, but needless to say, there were a lot of different ideas that were thrown out. Long-term, either no interest or low interest loans were out there. Increases to the premiums to the PBGC and possible co-pays from employees and employers and even unions to shore up the PBGC insurance program. Changes to how withdrawal liability is calculated. New rules regarding partitions. Composite plans, you name it. There were many ideas that were being thrown out in this legislation over the last couple of years, none of them necessarily going anywhere. And if you can go to slide 11, Kelly, that kind of brings us up to today. And, you know, my former mayor, Rahm Emanuel, and he stole it from Winston Churchill, said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And that's basically what happened here. In light of the pandemic, Congress decided to use the opportunity, since they're spending $1.9 trillion anyway, to try and address pension reform. Now, Congress actually tried to do this about 6 months ago in a prior COVID relief bill, but the Senate wasn't having anything to do with that. Obviously, there's a new administration, there's a new Congress, and this time the House was able to insert what they called the Butch-Lewis Act into the recovery law, the COVID law, and it got passed by the House. And it didn't include everything because they were setting it up to go through budget reconciliation so that they could get it passed by a majority vote of the Senate, as opposed to having to have that 60-vote majority to prevent a filibuster. So it was a slimmed-down version of Butch-Lewis. It went to the Senate. The parliamentarian, which had to decide whether or not it was all related to the budget, basically blessed all of it other than a provision regarding how withdrawal liability will be calculated, which we'll discuss in a few minutes. The Senate passed it. For whatever reason, they dropped the title, Butch-Lewis Act, it appears, because when it finally went back to the House and then to the President for signature, the name Butch-Lewis has been removed. We've been using it in honor of Butch-Lewis since, you know, this is basically a form of the Butch-Lewis Act. But I think going forward, it's just going to be known as the American Rescue Plan Act. But it was signed into law on March 11th. And if we go to the next slide, a very brief overview to let you know where we're going. The key provisions of the multi-employer portions of the Act are the special financial assistance for qualifying plans, which is providing money at no cost to those plans, estimated at $86 billion from the Congressional Budget Office. There's some other funding relief provided as well. And, you know, in terms of who's going to be impacted by this, and we'll have more discussion, the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, projects that basically 185 plans are going to be able to benefit from this. Now, keep in mind, there are just over 300 plans that are critical or critical in declining status, And then there's also other plans that aren't even listed there that are insolvent and theoretically could apply as well. So that's a brief overview as to how we got here today, and I'm going to turn it over to Jim to start going through the provisions of the Act itself.
Kelly, if we can go to slide 14. Hi, everyone. My name is Jim Lowick. I'm a partner in labor and employment in the Boston office, and I'm going to talk about, under the Act, I'm going to talk about plan eligibility for special financial assistance, and I'm also going to talk about the application process. In terms of plan eligibility under the Act, there are 4 different categories under which a plan is eligible for special financial assistance. The first category is for plans that are certified to be in critical and declining status in any plan year beginning in 2020 and continuing through 2022. The second category is for plans that had an approval for the suspension of benefits under the MPRA at any time prior to the effective date of the Act, which is March 12, 2021. The third category of eligibility is for plans that meet any of these following conditions in any plan year beginning in 2020 through 2022. I'm sorry, to correct that, it should be each of the following conditions. So each of these 3 conditions have to be met for this third category to be satisfied. The first condition is that the plan has to be certified to be in critical status. The second condition is that the plan has to have a modified funding percentage, which is defined under the Act as the current value of the plan's plan assets divided by current liabilities. That modified funding percentage has to be less than 40%. And then the third condition is that over 60% of the participants in the plan during that year have to be inactive. The Act actually states that the ratio of active participants to inactive participants has to be less than 2 to 3, but that's just a roundabout way of saying that more than 60% of the participants during that year have to be inactive. So if all 3 of those conditions are met, then this third category is satisfied, and the plan is eligible for special financial assistance. And then the fourth and the final category is for plans that became insolvent after December 16, 2014, have remained insolvent through the effective date of the Act, and have not been terminated. So if any of those 4 categories are met, the plan is eligible for special financial assistance. Next slide, please. And as far as the application process goes, there's not much as far as specifics in the statute. What Congress did in drafting the Act was defer to the PBGC to come up with regulations and guidance that would give more of the specifics on the application process as far as what documents need to be submitted and so forth. And they expressly stated in the Act that the PBGC is supposed to come up with these regulations and guidance within 120 days of the effective date of the Act. So by July 9th, 2021, PBGC is supposed to come up with these regulations and guidance. And the Act does spell out some of the specific things that the regulations and guidance issued by the PBGC are supposed to do. They're supposed to limit materials required to be submitted as part of the application to what's minimally necessary and no more than that. The regs and the guidance are supposed to specify effective dates for the transfer of the special financial assistance payments to plans. And the regs and the guidance are supposed to provide alternative applications for any plans that have been approved by the PBGC for a partition as of the effective date of the Act. Next slide, please. The law also states, as written, that the PBGC may limit applications through March 11, 2023, the first 2 years of the Act, to certain categories. So this is an important provision to be aware of, because some of the plans that are otherwise eligible for special financial assistance under the Act may not be able to apply until after March 11, 2023. And the way the Act handled this was it said that the PBGC may limit applications, and it lists 3 specific categories that the PBGC may limit. The first category is plans that are insolvent or are likely to be insolvent prior to 5 years after the effective date of the Act. The second category is plans for which the PBGC would be required to provide more than $1 billion in financial assistance if it wasn't for the special financial assistance under the Act. And the third category is for plans that have suspended benefits, had their suspension approved under the MPRA as of the effective date of the Act. And then there's a fourth category, and this is important to note, it's kind of a catch-all category that just says that the PBGC may limit applications to other plans as determined by the PBGC. So there's a couple important takeaways here. One is that the Act just says that the PBGC may limit applications. So there's nothing that says they have to or anything more definitive. And the other takeaway is this fourth category that says other plans is determined by PBGC. So the takeaway here is really the PBGC has discretion to limit applications as much or as little as they want during the first 2 years. And whatever the regs and the guidance that are issued by the PBGC, and these have to also be issued within the 120-day period. So we should know by July 9th, 2021, how the PBGC is going to limit applications. But however they do it, if you fall outside of that, but you're otherwise eligible as a plan, you're going to have to wait until after March 11, 2023 to apply for the special financial assistance. Next slide, please. And then moving on to the timing of the application process, the Act does give some specifics there. It does provide that there's a deadline for plans to apply, to submit at least their initial application, and that's December 31st, 2025. Now, when an initial application is submitted, the PBGC under the Act has 120 days to respond. They can respond by pointing out any inadequacies in the application, whether that's the fact that the plan isn't eligible for special financial assistance under the Act, or the documentation submitted is not considered adequate by the PBGC, or the assumptions that the plan use in calculating the amount of special financial assistance. And we'll get into that in a few minutes. But if these assumptions are unreasonable, the PBGC can also point that out. And if the PBGC does do this within the 120 days, then the plan can submit a revised application. Now, if the PBGC doesn't inform the plan of any inadequacies within that 120-day period, then the application is deemed to be approved and the plan should be entitled to receive the special financial assistance. The deadline for submitting the revised applications in the event something is inadequate is 1 year after the deadline for the initial applications. So it's December 31st, 2026. And then the final deadline I wanted to point out in the Act is that the Act states that payments, the special financial assistance payments, are supposed to be made by September 30th, 2030. So I'm going to move on now and hand it over to Alan. Alan and Song are going to talk about a variety of things, starting with the amount of payments under the Act.
Thanks, Jim. So I guess this is kind of where the rubber hits the road. Now we're going to turn to the amount of the financial assistance. So under the statute, the amount of the financial assistance is, can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. The amount of the financial assistance is the amount required for the plan to pay all benefits due through 2051. And that's the language the statute uses, all benefits due through 2051. Now, on a first read, that seems pretty straightforward. You can figure out what benefits are due. But you look a little closer, and it's actually not entirely clear what all benefits due means here. There's a couple of different interpretations, all of which can result in very different outcomes. Does it mean all the benefits accrued through 2051? Or does it mean perhaps all benefits accrued through the date of the payment of the financial assistance, and which are to be paid through 2051? And then there's no indication as to should the plan incorporate expected contributions and expected investment return in that calculation. These are all questions that will be critical to determining the amount of financial assistance, and we just don't know what that outcome will be yet. there's also a discussion, some views that this could actually just be pushing the problem down to future generations, kicking it down the road, as it were. And in other words, take a plan that was insolvent. If a plan is insolvent and is given financial assistance to pay benefits to 2051, what happens in 2052? Is the plan insolvent again, right back where it started from? Or will there be some other mechanism in place to ensure that the plan ends up in 2052 on a more financial footing? These are super important questions which we just don't know the answer to yet. And as I said, the outcome can result in vastly different amounts of assistance to be given to plans. The law makes it a point of saying that the projections should be made on a deterministic basis. So I think on its face, the way I would interpret that is that the projections are going to be a snapshot, some sort of snapshot. But we really don't know what the parameters of that snapshot are going to be at this point. So this is a big, big question for the American Rescue Act. The law also provides that the payment is to be made in a single lump sum, and that's to be made as soon as possible, as soon as practicable, as the law says, but no more than 1 year after approval. So there's a lot of discussion going around right now about what this means. I don't know if my other panel members want to comment on this.
Hi, Alan.
Anyone?
Tom here. No, I agree. I think that there's still a lot of uncertainty here, and I've seen a number of different possible interpretations about the all benefits due language. I think practitioners and people in the industry right now are still reluctant to assume that that means all accrued benefits as defined under the code and the guidance issued thereunder. But even the guidance stating that we need to make these projections based on a deterministic basis, I mean, we've seen different projections, even on that language alone, that can result in vastly different amounts of special financial assistance received, depending on whether you're, for example, looking on a year-by-year basis or a present value calculation. So I think, just to echo your point, there are still many questions here that remain unanswered and that we eagerly await guidance on.
Thanks.
And Alan, one other.
Go ahead.
Yeah, one other thing that I wanted to note was in the last bullet where there's the point that the payments are supposed to be made no more than a year after approval. It's not certain how that works with the fact that payments are supposed to be made by September 30th, 2030, and the applications are supposed to be put in 2025 or by 2026. So that's something hopefully the PBGC will provide some guidance as far as timing and how this is all going to fit together. But as of now, that is uncertain by the wording of the act.
That's right. So that's a good segue. Song is going to talk about the assumptions. We do have some guidance on assumptions. There are still questions, but Song is going to address some of that guidance.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you all for joining us here today. Could I have the next slide, please? So as Alan noted, there are still a number of uncertainties from the Act, but the Act does go so far as setting forth a number of assumptions that plan sponsors are supposed to use in both determining their eligibility for relief and also determining the amount of the special financial assistance. So starting with determining eligibility for relief, the Act specifies that plan sponsors, and these are plan sponsors that are going to be in critical and declining status, they're supposed to use the same actuarial assumptions that they had from their zone certification prior to 2021 for application purposes, unless they're clearly erroneous. And in addition to that, along those lines, plan sponsors are supposed to use those same actuarial assumptions for future zone certifications unless they are clearly unreasonable. Next slide, please. The Act also specifies that for purposes of determining the special financial assistance, we're going to be using similar concepts and using the same actuarial assumptions from prior zone certifications prior to 2021, but there's still two large questions related to the all benefits due language, as Alan noted previously, but also there's this carve out for interest rate or the interest rate assumption, where the Act specifies that there is a cap on the amount of interest that we are allowed to take into consideration for determining the amount of financial assistance. That rate is tied to the corporate bond rate for bonds maturing after 20 years. The specific rate is the third segment rate of the 24-month yield curve for corporate bonds maturing after 20 years. But the important takeaway is that it's tied to some benchmark, and currently as it stands, that interest rate is somewhere around 5.5%. And we're willing to guess that that interest rate is probably significantly lower than your multi-employer plans are using right now for funding and withdrawal liability calculation purposes. But for purposes of calculating the amount of special financial relief, we're using this significantly lower rate. And so that raises a few questions, starting with, well, what is the significance of that going to be for our multi-employer plans? And generally, if you're going to be using a lower rate in these calculations, what it's going to do is it's going to show your multi-employer plan as being more underfunded than it currently is if you are using a higher rate. And the reason for that is because we are assuming that the assets that you currently have are not going to be returning the same amount as we previously assumed. So we would obviously need more money now in order to meet the same obligations in the future. And so presumably what this would do if we cap the interest rate for these purposes is that it would increase the amount of special financial assistance that plans would receive compared to as if we were using the same rate that plans use for funding and withdrawal liability purposes. And finally, the last point here is that we are not, similar to the other assumptions, we are not going to be changing them unless they are clearly unreasonable or erroneous. Next slide, please. Oh, and then with that, I will turn it back over to Alan to discuss the additional conditions on relief.
Thanks, Alan. So once a plan receives a payment, the statute places certain conditions on how the money can be used and invested, and imposes certain other requirements on the plan. So first, the money can only be used to pay benefits and plan expenses. And further, the money has to be segregated from other plan assets, and it can only be invested in investment-grade bonds or other investments that the PBGC may identify. The Act also says that a plan receiving assistance will be deemed to be in critical status through 2051. Now, critical status plans are subject to certain restrictions. So absent any other guidance, presumably plans receiving assistance would also be subject to those restrictions. For example, the plan wouldn't be able to reduce contributions or implement a contribution suspension. They wouldn't be able to increase benefits or accruals. And there would be certain restrictions on lump sum payments. So presumably these restrictions would stay in place, again, absent any other guidance to the contrary. Also, if a plan becomes insolvent after receiving financial assistance, the regular insolvency rules would apply. In addition, a plan receiving assistance would not be eligible to apply for a benefit suspension under the MPRA. And in addition, if a plan had suspended benefits previously, the plan would have to reinstate those benefits, and they would have to be paid in a lump sum in 3 months or paid monthly in installments over 5 years. Next slide, please. So continuing with the conditions on relief, under the statute, the PBGC, working with the Treasury Department, is authorized to impose certain conditions. And those conditions relate to increases in future accrual rates, retroactive benefit improvements, allocation of plan assets, reductions of employer contributions, diversion of contributions to other plans, and allocation of expenses to other plans. And the PBGC may also impose or regulate withdrawal liability with respect to plans receiving assistance. Now, Ron is going to talk more about this later, but earlier versions of the Butch-Lewis Act included a provision stating that if an employer withdraws within 15 years after the plan receives assistance, the employer wouldn't see a reduction in its withdrawal liability. However, that was removed from the Act due to the budget reconciliation process. But in any event, the statute specifically authorizes the PBGC to issue regulations with respect to withdrawal liability. So we'll all be very anxious to see what those regulations are. The Act also lays out a couple areas where the PBGC may not impose restrictions. And those are with respect to prospective reductions in plan benefits, plan governance, and any funding rules with respect to a plan receiving assistance. Now, the Act doesn't set any deadline for issuing these regulations. But as Jim stated earlier, the regulations with respect to the application process are due in 4 months, mid-July, early July. So one would think that a plan applying for relief would certainly want to know what these other conditions are. So we would hope that the regulations with respect to these conditions would be issued contemporaneously or shortly thereafter. Otherwise, a plan would kind of be moving forward without all the information it needs. One other final item I wanted to mention here on this slide is the Act also increased the PBGC premium rate. Now, the PBGC premium rate is currently $31, and that is that's indexed for inflation. So in 2051, the Act provides that the premium will increase to $52. So I think folks expect the PBGC premium with current indexing to be around 40, mid-40s, low 40s in 2051. At that point in time, the rate will be bumped up to $52, and that would be for plan years beginning after 2030. Okay, now we're going to, next slide, please. We're going to talk about some general funding relief provisions from the Act. Song, you want to talk about the first one?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for that, Alan. And obviously, the key financial relief provisions of the Act are the special financial assistance, but the Act does provide for a few other provisions that apply to financially troubled plans generally. And the first of those being this temporary funding status relief. And what this does is it allows multi-employer plans to elect to retain their zone status from a previous year, from the prior year in 2020 or 2021. And that will be known as the designated plan year. The Act also provides that plans that were in critical and endangered status in the year prior to the designated plan year, they can elect not to make any updates to their applicable schedules until the year following the designated plan year, and no additional further notification would be required to do that, but they do have to notify individuals of its election. What's interesting with respect to this additional funding relief are two things, I think. One is, first of all, this opens it up to more plans, and not just plans in critical and declining status, but it's bifurcated. So the plans that are able to take or that are eligible for relief, if you're not in critical endangered status, you could decide to elect to freeze your zone status. But this election about not updating your applicable schedules, that's only applicable to plans in critical and endangered status. So big question is how helpful or effective will this be in providing relief to other plans that may not have qualified for the special financial relief? I think that obviously has yet to be seen, but in my opinion, I think freezing the zone status, I mean, that's helpful, but I don't think that that's going to have a huge financial impact on plans, because in my experience, zone status isn't something that's changing quickly on an annual basis. It's something that's usually you determine your funded status and then you're working towards improving it. Whereas not having to update your applicable schedules, that might be somewhat more beneficial to parties that are able to take advantage of that relief. But again, it's limited to plans in critical and endangered status. So next slide, please. Another form of relief that's available for financially troubled plans, and again, this opens it up to not just critically endangered status plans, but plans that are in critical status or also endangered status. They may elect to extend their funding improvement plan or rehab plan as applicable from 10 to 15 years or 15 to 20 years for seriously endangered plans. And this will begin with plan years beginning on or after December 30th, 2019. Again, this could provide some relief, obviously not as much as the special financial assistance, but this is something that opens it up to a broader audience compared to the previous forms. Next slide, please. And Alan, did you want to talk about the asset?
Sure. Thanks, Song. So the Act provides some relief similar to the relief provided after the Great Recession. Excuse me. First off, the Act provides that investment losses incurred in the 2 plan years ending after February 20th, 2020 may be smoothed over 10 years rather than 5. Now, smoothing is allowed to dampen the volatility in the market. If there's a big loss one year, the plan doesn't have to recognize it that year all at once, but for its actuarial valuation, but it can recognize it in pieces over multiple years. So this provision just extends that period from 5 years to 10 years. And the law also raises the upper end of the asset valuation corridor from 120% to 130% of the market value of plan assets. So in other words, the plans are allowed to have an actuarial value that exceeds market value by an additional 10%. And this can be useful when there has been a big market loss. Next slide, please. So again, similar to the relief provided in 2008 and 2009 after the Great Recession, the law allows plans to amortize investment losses for the first 2 plan years ending after February 29th, 2020, over a 30-year period. And what this really means is that 30-year period is measured from the year losses are incurred. So what it really provides is an extended amortization period of 29 years. So you may see that 29 years pop up. That's why people use the 29 years, because that is really the extended amortization period from following the year the investment loss was incurred. So this provision that was put in place after the Great Recession allowed plans to amortize investment losses over an extended period. So the Act adds another piece to this. It allows an extended amortization period for investment losses and other losses related to COVID-19, including experienced losses related to reductions in contributions, reductions in employment, and deviations from anticipated retirement rates. So this could be very useful for some plans, especially plans in industries that were especially hard hit by the pandemic. Plans in certain industries hardly felt the pandemic. Other plans were severely impacted. And for everybody, those listening, we're going to give you the CLE code right now. The code is SS, as in Seyfarth Shaw, 8035. Again, SS 8035. Okay, now we turn to a discussion of the impact for plans and employers. What's all this mean for plans and employers? We're going to start off with the impact on plans. Next slide, please. So, Song, you want to start this off?
Sure. And please feel free to chime in. But my general thoughts and experience in this area is that it's largely going to depend on the funded status of the plan itself, because so much of the relief in the Act, it's directed towards plans that are in critical and declining, or critical and endangered status. It questions how effective the relief will be for plans if you're outside of that zone status, or what additional forms of or optional forms of relief that you have available to you. And so if you're not in critical and declining status, then you obviously miss out on the bulk of the relief available. And so that really kind of raises the question of what do you do if one, freezing your zone status doesn't provide the financial relief that you need, or if you're still going to find yourself financially troubled after extending any applicable rehab plan or funding improvement plan.
Yeah, and just to follow that up, the full impact obviously we really won't be able to assess that until we get regulations that fleshes out more of what this means. And also, I think an important item to note is what this doesn't do as far as the impact on plans. This doesn't have a lot of the other provisions that were tossed around in previous iterations. For example, there are no benefit. This doesn't provide for any benefit cuts. It doesn't mandate an actuarial assumption, which some other iterations actually put a cap on actuarial assumptions, the interest assumption. And it doesn't impose a huge increase on PBGC premiums. Some other iterations actually spread out PBGC premiums to all stakeholders, employers, unions, plans, and participants. So until that full impact, that full guidance comes, we really won't know what the full impact is here. And as far as the funding relief, that's, again, similar to what was provided after the Great Recession. In this case, after 2020, plans are really in kind of different spots. I think after the Great Recession, just about every plan was hit very hard. But after 2020, many plans have in fact recovered and have made up the ground they lost and then some. So that funding relief may not be that useful to those plans. On the other hand, if a plan had a plan year that ended, let's say, right when the market was at its lowest point in late February, March, or April, those plans, if their plan year ended at that time, then they would definitely appreciate some of these measures. So it really depends on the plan. I also wanted to say that as far as the assistance goes, I advise one plan that is in fact insolvent, but that plan became insolvent in 2005. So although that plan would really like to access this assistance, it's not eligible. So those plans that became insolvent before 2014 are not eligible for this. I think one other point I wanted to make is, if going back to slide 14, can we go back to slide 14 for just a minute? So as Jim described these eligibility requirements, and with respect to the third one, where we have these three criteria that a plan needs to meet, the second bullet there, the plan has to have a modified funding percentage of less than 40%. I just wanted to highlight that. So that number is different than the regular actuarial funding percentage that you might see that a plan might use as its funding percentage. This number is the current value of assets over the current liabilities. This number could be significantly less than what the plan's typical actuarial funded percentage is. So a plan could have, 70, 80% funded percentage, but this modified funding percentage could actually be below 40%. It could actually qualify. So I just want to point that out, that if you think your plan doesn't qualify, you need to be sure that you check the modified funding percentage to see if it might qualify. And then we can move forward again to the next slide, please.
All right, thanks, Alan. Jim and I are going to take this slide a little bit, but like Alan said, I think one question here is we all know critical and declining are in. We know insolvent, if you were insolvent after a certain period of time, you're in. If you've got the multi-employer pension relief suspension, you're in. It's those critical status plans, whether they're going to meet those qualifications, which is really going to depend a lot on how the statute's interpreted in the regs. But from an employer standpoint, obviously, if you're in just a plain old critical status plan, you're going to want to be keeping an eye on that. But there's three things that we think have major impact for employers to consider. One, mass withdrawal. We understand many employers in critical or critical declining status plans are concerned about possible mass withdrawals, or when a plan becomes insolvent, the pension benefits for their employees and their retirees goes down. So they have concerns about that. Obviously, if the plans are qualifying for special financial assistance, any concerns that an employer may have that a mass withdrawal or insolvency is around the corner, whether valid or not, kind of gets pushed out, maybe to 30 years if the act goes as everyone planned, or beyond that. It's hard to say. But any employers that have immediate concerns, those concerns are going to seem to go away. Contribution rates, as I think Alan and everyone's already said, I mean, anyone who takes the special financial assistance is going to still be considered a critical plan, but the PBGC can make regulations on reducing contribution rates, despite the fact that otherwise a critical status plan might not be able to do so. And it'll be interesting because I know some employers are in funds who are critical status, and while some critical status funds have put a cap on the increases, others still have annual increases every year, and for some employers in some industries, that's becoming non-competitive. And if there could be some sort of relief to at least end the increases, that could be beneficial for employers. And then probably the big question that everyone has from an employer standpoint, Jim, is withdrawal liability, right?
Jim, I think you're muted.
There we go. Sorry about that. A couple of points about withdrawal liability. Both Alan and Ron mentioned that the final version of the Act left out this provision stating that participating employers wouldn't see any reduction in withdrawal liability due to receiving special financial assistance under the Act for the 15-year period. That was left out because of the reconciliation process in order to get the Act passed. So it's going to be up to the PBGC what they want to do. There's a lot of speculation that since this was Congress's intent in passing the law, and it was just left out because of this reconciliation process, that the PBGC will put that back in. But we can't be certain about that until the guidance and the regs come out, whenever that is. And then the other point is that there's nothing in the Act about other provisions of how withdrawal liability is calculated, nothing about payment schedules or the 20-year cap or mass withdrawal rules or anything like that, and how that would affect employers who are receiving special financial assistance. So that's just going to be a wait and see for the regs and guidance. So the takeaway here is that we know employers are very curious about how this is going to affect them as far as withdrawal liability. We have maybe an idea or a hunch about this 15-year provision, but we don't have anything more than that. And then we're just going to have to wait and see what the PBGC does as far as coming out with more specifics on how withdrawal liability is going to be calculated. So wait and see is the takeaway.
And it may not just be after the regulations, because there may be challenges to those regulations as well. I mean, the regs, they basically just say they can do regs and guidance with regards to withdrawal liability, presumably for people that are taking plans that are taking special financial assistance. Well, I think everyone assumes there's going to be some sort of, you can't use this money if you haven't withdrawn if you've withdrawn from the plan within 15 years or something along those lines. If the PBGC goes beyond that and tries to do other changes to withdrawal liability for plans that take the special financial assistance, there could be challenges to whether or not the PBGC is exceeding its authority on this. Because obviously the statute is pretty clear on how withdrawal liability is to be paid. So, yeah, keep an eye out for that. There could be, should be interesting to see what happens and what comes out of those regulations. And with that, we're going to do a little bit of more discussion here. The panel is kind of put together, if you go to the next slide, some of the big questions that we see, and I'm going to kind of speed this along a little bit because we're not running behind time, but we're a little bit behind time. Some of the questions that came to us as we were going through the statute several times, obviously how many people will qualify. CBO says 180 some, who knows what the number could be, and the fate of those who don't qualify. Those are questions that are out there. But Alan and Song, quickly, any thoughts on, employers, how many people you think participating funds, might be able to benefit from this? Any thoughts on whether the CBO is wrong?
No, Ron, I think, I don't know if I would say they were wrong. I think they said there would be 185, maybe perhaps on the average, but as we've discussed, they ran a number of different models, and some of those models came up with over 300 plans getting assistance. So, once you look at the critical and declining plans, there are maybe 114, 120 critical and declining plans. There, I think last time I checked, 18 plans that have benefit suspensions. And then after that, it's kind of like, let's see what happens. It's going to be a big question as to how many plans actually end up with this assistance.
Yeah, and a lot of that may depend on obviously the assumptions that PBGC adopts, and even the interest rate question. I mean, you talked about that set interest rate as for the amount of the benefit, but I think isn't there some question when I read the statute, I could read that capped interest rate of 5.5% also being applied for purposes of determining whether or not you're in critical and declining status. I mean, do you have any ideas to the extent to which that interest rate cap might apply to whether or not a plan might be eligible as a critical or critical declining plan?
I agree, Ron, that there is some uncertainty there. It specifically applies to the cap. Specifically applies to the determination of the amount, and whether it applies to elsewhere. That's a question I think that we'll need further guidance on.
Yeah, it's in the same section about the assumptions for the amount, and at least when you take a look at the statute, it talks about if critical and declining status before 2021 and then after 2021, there's actually a reference in there to interest rate when they're talking about assumptions. So I think it's going to be interesting to see, because if a plan that uses a 7.5% assumption rate to determine critical and declining status can drop it down to 5.5%, you could greatly increase the number of plans that are going to automatically qualify, or even make critical plans even more critical so that they might be able to qualify. I know some clients have had questions to me already about the impact of this on hybrid plans. Some multi-employer plans have adopted these two-pool methods where you can pay your withdrawal liability at discount and move to the other side of the house, so to speak, where you're assessed withdrawal liability on a direct attribution method. The way my read of the law is, there's nothing here that changes the ability of plans to do this. I think there could be some questions in terms of how the regs come out, if the regs specifically limit your ability to reduce contribution rates, or to and perhaps even maybe have regulations in terms of withdrawal liability settlements you can do. That might impact a plan's ability to entice employers to move into hybrid plans. And I think a lot of employers are going to take a wait-and-see approach at the moment, because their desire to move into a hybrid plan might not be as great, knowing that there might not be a mass withdrawal event or increasing withdrawal liability theoretically, in light of the fact special financial assistance is being provided. Open question to the group here. What are your initial thoughts on the impact? And I know it's really early and we don't have the regs, but what the impact of this law might have on employers' ongoing participation in the fund. Will this cause employers to stay in the fund, new employers to join funds? What do you think?
I know that this question at least has come up a number of times, and I've heard answers going both ways. I know that some people are concerned that employers are going to try to leave funds now before the regulations come out, presumably in case something comes out negative towards participating employers. But I guess just personally, I don't necessarily think that will be the case. I think that employers will tend to stick around to see what happens. And the reason why is because if employers choose to leave now, none of the other rules regarding the calculation of withdrawal liability has changed. And they're still in a position where they would have to pay any full withdrawal liability that's onto them. But if they at least stay in the plan, there's some theoretical chance that the PBGC could be issuing some sort of guidance that's helpful to participating employers and allows them to participate in plans receiving this financial assistance by getting some sort of a corresponding reduction in their withdrawal liability. But that's just a guess on my end that employers will stay in plans with the hopes that it might get better for them.
Yeah, I think that's my take as well. I think there's a lot of wait and see here. Obviously, some trepidation with regards to the PBGC regulations. And the other thing to keep in mind is one of the comments made. I mean, obviously, employers, for the most part, unless they're closing their business, would have to be bargaining with the unions if they wanted to get out. And a lot of the reason for employers when they bargain to get out has been concerns about mass withdrawal and insolvency, because obviously their employees are concerned about insolvency as well. With those issues going away, I think it's probably going to be harder to bargain out of funds that are getting this assistance, even if an employer wanted to. So, that's something to keep in mind. I know we're running close to the top. We're at the top of the hour. Just spend 2 seconds here. We've already talked about we don't know what the regs are going to say about these things and their impact. Last 2 questions. I'll reverse it, though. Broader pension reform. Panelists, do you think that there's going to be a possibility that, Congress will actually spend some time and actually do some of the broader pension reform they're talking about, or is this basically going to be the law for the next 30 years unless it also fails to meet its objectives like previous bills have.
Ron, I think I would say that certainly this law certainly takes some of the wind out of the sail to for the efforts to implement pension reform. It takes takes the big questions off the table, but whether or not there's additional reform going forward, one would hope there might be something for other plans, but I'm just thinking that a lot of the incentives may have been taken out by this.
Yeah, given how hard it's been to get pension reform in prior years, I suspect you're right, especially given the current split in the Senate. I think the one thing here that everyone has questions on, and maybe the regs will help us, on the accuracy of the special funding assistance lump sums to meet objectives. We now have different interest rates for amounts. We have different interest rates probably given the investment limitations of plans that get the money. They may be only able to invest in in bonds that have a lower return objective than even the government is expecting, when they did the lump sum payment and calculated using a 5.5% interest rate. I think there's a lot of concern on everyone's parts here is whether or not at the end of the day, the money the plans are going to receive and the ability to invest it is going to be sufficient for them to meet the objectives, or whether maybe 15 or 20 years from now after you get a stock market crash or what have you, it's back in front of Congress because now, even though this money's been paid out, these funds are in trouble again. And I don't think anyone will have, if you know the answer to that question, you probably know who's going to win the NCAA tournament, and you would have had a perfect tournament bracket, and we know no one's done that. If you can go to the next slide, just in the next two slides, there you go, next steps. We're at the top of our hour. I think we've answered the questions. We've done this. Obviously, everyone needs to observe the development of the regulations, see what happens. Plans, you're going to want to be looking at whether or not you want to apply and determine your eligibility as quickly as possible, and clearly monitor these regulations and comment because there's going to be a comment period. Employers, same issues really. See whether your plans qualify. Keep an eye out on what the rules are imposed on qualification on employers, in particular withdrawal liability, and factor that into your equations in terms of the long-term impact you think this is going to have on the plans and whether or not this changes your analysis one way or the other in terms of ongoing participation in funds, what have you. But it's definitely, I think I can speak for everyone, it's a positive. It's $86 billion on an issue that we didn't have a month and a half ago. And I think we can just hope that the PBGC does a better job in terms of putting together regulations that will actually work on this than perhaps they did with the MPRA. Panelists, any last words before we go? All right, well then on behalf of the panelists and Seyfarth Shaw, I'd like to thank all of you for attending. You will be getting copies of the program. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. And don't forget to subscribe to our Beneficial Years blog and our Labor Management Relations blog. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for attending.